The wedding hall was full of people, but Claire felt completely alone. She stood beside Daniel in a white dress that did not feel like hers, smiling for photographs that meant nothing. Nobody in that room knew the truth. This was not a love marriage, it was a deal. Her father owed money to Daniel's family, and marriage was the only way to erase that debt without shame. Daniel had agreed to marry her because his father was dying and wanted to see his son settled before he passed away. Neither of them wanted this, but here they were, standing in front of hundreds of guests, pretending to be happy. Claire caught Daniel's eyes for a brief second during the ceremony. There was no warmth in them, no excitement, just a tired acceptance, the look of a man doing something he had no power to refuse. She looked away quickly, her chest tightening. She had imagined her wedding day so differently when she was younger. She had imagined laughter, joy, a husband who could not stop looking at her. Instead, she got silence, dressed up as celebration. After the ceremony ended, the guests left one by one, offering their blessings and their wishes for a happy life together. Claire smiled and thanked each person, playing her part perfectly. Daniel did the same, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, acting like a man who had just married the love of his life. But the moment the last guest walked out the door, the mask fell off his face completely. He loosened his tie, let out a long breath, and walked toward the stairs without saying a single word to her. Claire stood in the empty hallway, still wearing her wedding dress, watching him disappear up the stairs. She waited for him to turn around, to say something, anything. He did not. She heard a door close somewhere above her, and the sound echoed through the quiet house like a verdict. She was married, and she was already alone. That first night, Claire sat on the edge of a bed in a room that had been prepared for her, a room separate from Daniel's. She had heard whispers from the house staff earlier that day, quiet words exchanged between two women arranging flowers, saying that the young master had asked for 2 rooms to be prepared, not 1. She had told herself it was probably nothing, some old family custom, or perhaps a temporary arrangement until they settled in. But sitting there now, alone, in her wedding dress, with no husband beside her, and no sound coming from his room, she understood the truth. This was not temporary. This was how it would be. She did not cry that night. She told herself she was stronger than that. She removed her jewelry piece by piece, placing each item carefully into a small box, and she folded her wedding dress and hung it in the closet, like it was any other piece of clothing. Then she lay down in the large, empty bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of a house that was now supposed to be her home. The next morning, Claire woke up early, the way she always did. Old habits do not disappear just because a life changes overnight. She showered, dressed simply, and walked down to the kitchen, hoping to find some sense of normal life beginning. Daniel's mother, a graceful woman named Margaret, was already there, sipping tea by the window. Margaret looked up and gave Claire a small, sad smile. It was the kind of smile people give when they know something painful but cannot say it out loud. "Good morning, dear," she said softly. "Did you sleep well?" Claire nodded, though it was a lie. "Yes, thank you." Margaret studied her for a long moment, as if she wanted to say more, to warn her about something, to prepare her for what was coming. But she simply patted the seat next to her and said, "Come, sit, have some tea." Claire sat, grateful for even this small kindness. She learned quickly that Margaret was the one person in that large house who did not treat her like a stranger. Daniel's father had passed away just 3 weeks after the wedding, and after that, the house grew even quieter, heavier with grief, that nobody spoke about openly. Daniel became more distant, more consumed by his work, more determined to avoid any conversation that was not strictly necessary. Claire tried, in those early days, to build something out of nothing. She learned Daniel's favorite meals from the kitchen staff, and prepared them herself, standing in the kitchen for hours, hoping her effort would be noticed. She waited for him at the dinner table many nights, watching the food grow cold, until she finally understood that he was not coming home to eat with her. She left notes on his desk, small kind words, hoping for a reply that never came. She learned his schedule, his habits, the sound of his car pulling into the driveway late at night, long after she had already gone to bed pretending to be asleep. One evening, about 2 months into the marriage, Claire worked up the courage to knock on his study door. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say in her mind a dozen times. She wanted to ask him, simply and honestly, if there was any chance for them to build something real together. She knocked twice, softly, and waited. The door opened, and Daniel stood there, his tie loosened, his eyes tired from work. He looked at her with an expression that was not unkind, but not warm either. It was the look a man gives a stranger who has interrupted something important. "Yes?" he asked. Claire's carefully rehearsed words disappeared from her mind. "I just wanted to see if you needed anything," she said instead, her voice smaller than she intended. Daniel studied her for a moment. "No, I'm fine, thank you." Then he closed the door, gently but firmly, and Claire stood alone in the hallway once again, feeling the same emptiness she had felt on her wedding night. She walked back to her room and sat by the window, watching the garden below, the flowers Margaret had planted years ago still blooming, despite the sadness of the house around them. She thought about her own family, her parents, who believed she was happy, who believed this marriage had solved all their problems. She could not tell them the truth. She could not tell anyone the truth. So she carried it alone, folding her disappointment neatly, the same way she had folded her wedding dress on the first night. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Claire adjusted to a rhythm of loneliness that slowly became familiar. She woke early, managed the household with Margaret's guidance, read books in the library to fill the silent afternoons, and waited every evening for a husband who rarely acknowledged her presence. She was not treated cruelly, not exactly. Daniel never raised his voice at her, never said anything hurtful directly to her face. He simply acted as though she did not exist, and somehow, that quiet erasure hurt more than any harsh word ever could. She remembered the day, about 4 months into the marriage, when Daniel's company held a small dinner event, and she was expected to attend as his wife. She had spent the entire afternoon preparing, choosing a dress carefully, practicing polite conversation in the mirror, hoping that maybe in public, surrounded by his colleagues, he might treat her differently. Maybe pretending to be a happy couple in front of others would create even a small spark of connection between them. When they arrived at the event, Daniel walked slightly ahead of her, greeting colleagues with practiced charm. When someone asked about her, he simply said, "This is Claire," without any warmth in his voice, without even placing a hand on her back the way other husbands did with their wives. She smiled through the entire evening, answering questions politely, laughing at jokes that were not funny, while Daniel barely looked in her direction. By the end of the night, her cheeks hurt from smiling, and her heart hurt from something much deeper. On the drive home, she sat quietly beside him, watching the streetlights pass by the window. She wanted to ask him why he could not even pretend, just for one evening, that their marriage meant something. But she stayed silent, because she already knew the answer would break something inside her that she was not ready to lose. That night, lying awake in her room, Claire allowed herself, for the first time since the wedding, to truly grieve the life she thought she would have. She cried quietly into her pillow, careful not to make a sound that might reach the hallway. She cried for the girl she used to be, the one who believed in love, who believed that kindness given freely would eventually be returned. She did not yet know that this quiet, lonely night was only the beginning of 2 long years that would test everything she believed about herself. Outside her window, the moon hung low over the garden, indifferent to the pain inside the house. Somewhere down the hall, Daniel sat alone in his study, staring at papers he was not really reading, carrying his own silent burden that he had never learned how to share. 2 people, living under the same roof, bound together by duty and debt, each locked inside walls of their own making, neither one aware that the distance between them would soon change both of their lives forever. Claire finally fell asleep as the first light of morning touched the horizon, exhausted from a night of quiet tears, unaware that tomorrow would bring the same silence, and the day after that, and many, many days after that, stretching into a future she could not yet imagine. She only knew one thing for certain as she drifted off. She had married a man who did not want her, and somehow, she had to find a way to survive it. 2 years passed, and the house on Maple Hill Road had grown into something Claire barely recognized as a home. It was beautiful on the outside, with its tall white pillars and its garden full of roses that Margaret still tended with love. But inside, it felt like a museum, a place where everything looked perfect and nothing felt alive. Claire had learned to live inside that stillness, moving through her days with a quiet grace that hid the ache she carried underneath. Daniel's routine had not changed in 2 years. He left before sunrise and returned long after dark, sometimes smelling faintly of expensive cologne that was not his usual scent, sometimes carrying the tired weight of a man who had spent the entire day avoiding his own home. He and Claire passed each other in hallways like two guests staying at the same hotel, polite but distant, familiar but strange. Claire still remembered her first wedding anniversary. She had spent days preparing a small dinner. Nothing extravagant, just a simple meal made with her own hands. The kind of gesture she hoped might remind Daniel that a year had passed, and they were still, technically, husband and wife. She lit candles in the dining room, set the table carefully, and waited. 7 o'clock came and went, then 8, then 9. By 10, the candles had burned down to small stubs of wax, and the food had gone cold on the table. Daniel walked in at 10:30, glanced at the table, glanced at her, and said only, "I had a meeting run late." "I already ate." Then he walked upstairs without another word, without noticing the candles, without noticing that she had worn her nicest dress, without noticing anything at all. Claire sat alone at that table for a long time that night, staring at the cold food, feeling something inside her crack just slightly. She did not cry. She was tired of crying. She simply cleared the table, blew out the last candle, and went to bed. Her second wedding anniversary was approaching now, only a few weeks away, but Claire found herself no longer counting down to it with hope. She had learned, over 2 long years, not to expect anything from Daniel. She still managed the household, still helped Margaret with family matters, still smiled politely whenever they had guests. But somewhere along the way, the smile had become a performance rather than a feeling. There were moments during those 2 years that stayed with her more than others, small wounds that never fully healed. She remembered the family gathering for Margaret's birthday, when Daniel's cousin, a cheerful woman named Grace, had asked Claire how she and Daniel had met, expecting a sweet love story. Claire had smiled and given a vague, polite answer, and beside her, Daniel had said nothing to soften the moment, nothing to make her feel less alone in that lie. He had simply excused himself to speak with a business associate across the room, leaving her standing there to finish the conversation by herself. She remembered the night she had a fever, her body aching, her forehead burning with heat. She had knocked weakly on Daniel's study door, hoping he might notice she was unwell, hoping he might ask if she needed anything. He had opened the door, looked at her flushed face for a brief second, and said, "You should get some rest. I have an early meeting tomorrow." Then he had closed the door again. Claire had walked back to her room alone, made herself a cup of tea with shaking hands, and cared for herself through the night, just as she had learned to do with everything else. It was not that Daniel was cruel in the way people imagine cruelty. He never shouted. He never said hurtful things directly to her face. His cruelty was quieter than that, and in some ways, harder to bear. It was the cruelty of being forgotten, of being treated as furniture in a house rather than a person with a heart. Claire often thought that if he had simply been unkind with words, she might have found a way to fight back, to defend herself, to demand better treatment. But how does a person fight against silence? How does a person demand to be seen by someone who has already decided not to look? Margaret noticed everything, of course. She was not blind to her son's coldness, and though she never spoke badly about him, she found small ways to show Claire kindness that filled some of the empty spaces in her days. They would sit together in the garden most afternoons, drinking tea, talking about books, about old memories, about anything that had nothing to do with the marriage that was slowly hollowing Claire out from the inside. "You deserve more than this," Margaret said to her one afternoon, about a year and a half into the marriage, as they sat beneath the shade of an old oak tree. "I see the way you try. I see how hard you work to make this house feel warm. My son does not deserve a wife like you." Claire had smiled sadly at those words, grateful for the kindness, but unable to accept comfort that felt too close to pity. "He lost his father right after we married," she said softly, always finding a reason to defend him, even to herself. "Grief changes people." Margaret had reached over and taken her hand gently. "Grief does not last 2 years, dear. Grief does not explain everything." Claire had not responded to that. She had simply looked out at the garden, at the roses blooming despite the coldness surrounding them, and wondered how much longer she could keep making excuses for a man who had never once tried to make her feel loved. There was one particular evening, about 20 months into the marriage, that Claire would later think of as a quiet turning point, though she did not fully recognize it at the time. She had organized a small dinner for Daniel's business partners, working for days to prepare everything perfectly, hoping to be helpful to him in some way, hoping that perhaps contributing to his success might create some kind of bridge between them. The dinner went well. The guests praised the food, praised the elegant table setting, praised Claire's warmth and hospitality. After the guests left, Daniel walked into the kitchen, where Claire was helping the staff clean up, and for a brief moment, she thought he might finally say something kind, something that acknowledged her effort. Instead, he said, "The Hendersons were impressed. That should help close the deal next week." He was not talking about her. He was not thanking her. He was simply noting how her effort had benefited his business, the same way he might note that a good weather forecast had helped a company event. Claire had nodded and continued cleaning, saying nothing, but something inside her chest had shifted that night, a small but permanent crack forming in the patience she had carried for so long. As the second anniversary approached, Claire found herself thinking more and more about her own life before the marriage. She had been ambitious once, working toward a career in design, before the arranged marriage had pulled her into this house full of silence. She had let that dream fade quietly, telling herself there was no time for it now, that her role was to be a wife, to manage a household, to wait patiently for a husband who might someday come around. But lately, a small voice inside her kept whispering a question she had been too afraid to ask herself clearly. What if he never comes around? What am I waiting for? One evening, just days before their second anniversary, Claire sat by her window, as she often did, watching the driveway for Daniel's car, an old habit she could not seem to break, even after everything. She saw his car pull in around midnight, later than usual, and she watched him step out, straighten his jacket, and walk toward the house, with the same tired, distracted expression he always wore. She did not go downstairs to greet him. She simply watched from her window, feeling something strange settle over her, something that was not quite anger, and not quite sadness, but a kind of quiet clarity she had never felt before. She realized, sitting there in the dark, that she had spent 2 years of her life trying to earn the attention of a man who had decided, long before she ever arrived in his life, that he did not want to give it. The next morning, she woke up and, for the first time in 2 years, she did not immediately think about Daniel's schedule, about what he might need, about how she could make herself useful to him. She simply got up, dressed for herself rather than for anyone else's approval, and walked downstairs to have breakfast with Margaret, feeling lighter than she had in a very long time, though she could not yet explain why. She did not know it then, but that quiet morning was the beginning of something new inside her, a slow and steady shift that would soon change everything about how she moved through her own life. The waiting was almost over, not because Daniel had changed, but because Claire finally had. The second wedding anniversary arrived on a quiet Tuesday, and Claire decided, without much thought, not to plan anything at all. No candles, no special dinner, no nice dress worn in hope of being noticed. She simply lived the day as she would any other, and there was a strange relief in that decision, like putting down a heavy bag she had been carrying for far too long. That evening, she sat in the library reading, a cup of tea beside her, when she heard Daniel's car pull into the driveway earlier than usual. She glanced at the clock. It was only 8, at least 3 hours before his normal return. She did not think much of it, assuming perhaps his meeting had ended early, and she returned her attention to her book. She heard him enter the house, heard his footsteps in the hallway, and then heard him speaking, his voice low but audible from where she sat near the slightly open library door. He was on the phone, and from the tone of his voice, relaxed and familiar, in a way she rarely heard him speak to anyone, she realized he was not discussing business. "No, it's fine. I told you. It's not a real marriage," Daniel said, his voice carrying easily through the quiet house. "It was for my father. He's gone now, so honestly, it doesn't matter anymore. She's just there. It's not like anything is going to change." Claire's hands went still around her teacup. She did not move, did not breathe, waiting to hear more, some part of her hoping desperately that she had misunderstood. I know, Daniel continued, laughing softly at something the person on the other end had said. "Maybe once things settle with the company, I'll figure something out. It's complicated with the families involved, but it's not like I feel anything for her. It was never that kind of marriage. There was a pause, and then Daniel's voice grew softer, almost tender, a tone Claire had never once heard him use in 2 years of marriage. I miss you too. This will work itself out eventually. Just be patient with me. Claire sat frozen in the library chair, the book forgotten in her lap, her tea growing cold beside her. She heard his footsteps move away, up the stairs, the study door closing behind him, and only then did she allow herself to move, to set down the teacup with trembling hands, to finally take a full breath. She was not entirely surprised. Some deep, quiet part of her had suspected something like this for a long time, sensed it in the late nights, the unexplained absences, the faint traces of unfamiliar perfume she had noticed once or twice on his jacket, and told herself she had imagined. But suspecting something and hearing it, confirmed in his own voice, were two very different experiences. The confirmation settled into her chest like a stone, heavy and undeniable. She sat in the library for a long time that night, long after the house had gone silent, thinking not about anger, though anger would come later, but about clarity. 2 years. 2 years of trying, of waiting, of making excuses for a man who had, from the very beginning, already decided that she was not worth his effort, his honesty, or his respect. 2 years of folding herself smaller and smaller, hoping that eventually there would be enough space for him to notice her. And the entire time, he had already made his choice. He simply had not told her. Claire went to bed that night without crying, without confronting him, without doing anything dramatic at all. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, and somewhere in the quiet hours before dawn, something inside her finally settled into place. She was done, not angry enough to scream, not broken enough to fall apart, just simply, quietly, completely done. The next morning, she woke up at her usual time, but something about the way she moved through her routine felt different. She showered, dressed, and looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment, really looked, in a way she had not allowed herself to do in years. She saw a woman who had spent 2 years shrinking herself for someone who had never planned to make room for her. She saw tired eyes, but underneath the tiredness, she saw something else beginning to stir. Not hope for Daniel, hope for herself. She walked downstairs and found Margaret in the kitchen, and for the first time, Claire did not hide the truth from her. She sat down across from the older woman, took a steady breath, and said, "I heard him last night. On the phone. There is someone else. There has been, I think, for a long time." Margaret's face did not show shock, only a deep, tired sadness, and Claire realized in that moment that Margaret had likely known, or at least suspected, far longer than she had. "Oh, Claire," Margaret said softly, reaching across the table to hold her hand. "I am so sorry. I should have told you what I suspected sooner. I did not want to hurt you without proof." "It's all right," Claire said, and strangely, she meant it. "I think some part of me already knew. I just wasn't ready to admit it." "What will you do?" Margaret asked gently. Claire considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't know yet, but I know I'm done waiting for him to choose me. I spent 2 years trying to earn something that was never going to be given. I think it's time I started living for myself instead." Margaret squeezed her hand, her eyes glistening slightly. "You are a remarkable woman, Claire. I always believed that. I only wish my son could see it too. But whatever you decide, I want you to know you have my support. You are not alone in this house, whatever happens next." Those words meant more to Claire than Margaret could have known. For 2 years, she had felt invisible in this house, tolerated but never truly seen. Hearing Margaret speak with such certainty, such genuine care, gave her a small but steady foundation to stand on as she began to imagine what her life might look like if she stopped waiting for Daniel entirely. Over the following days, Claire made small but deliberate changes to her life. She stopped preparing Daniel's favorite meals when she knew he would not be home to eat them. She stopped leaving notes on his desk. She stopped listening for the sound of his car in the driveway, stopped rearranging her evenings around a hope that had already died. It was strange at first how much lighter she felt simply by releasing the weight of expectation she had carried for so long. She began reaching out to old friends she had drifted away from during the marriage, people who had known her before she became someone's overlooked wife. She called Emma, a close friend from her university days, who now worked at a design firm in the city, someone she had lost touch with after the wedding. embarrassed by how small her world had become. Emma answered the phone with genuine excitement, and within minutes, it felt as though no time had passed at all. "I've missed you," Emma said. "I always wondered how you were doing, but I didn't want to intrude if you were busy building your new life." Claire laughed softly, a real laugh, one she had not felt in a long time. "Honestly, I think I forgot how to have a life outside that house, but I'm working on remembering." They made plans to meet for coffee that weekend, and Claire found herself looking forward to something, truly looking forward to it, for the first time in longer than she could remember. It was such a small thing, meeting a friend for coffee, but it felt like the first real step toward reclaiming pieces of herself that she had set aside for 2 long years. Daniel, meanwhile, noticed nothing different at first. He continued his same routine, leaving early, returning late, offering the same brief, hollow greetings whenever their paths crossed in the house. He did not notice that Claire no longer waited up for him. He did not notice that the kitchen no longer smelled of meals prepared specifically for his return. He did not notice the small, quiet transformation happening right under his own roof, because he had never truly looked closely enough to notice her at all. That, Claire realized with a strange sense of calm, was exactly the problem, and exactly the reason she no longer needed his attention to feel whole. She had spent 2 years trying to be seen by someone who had chosen not to look. Now, she decided, she would spend her time being seen by people who actually wanted to look, starting with herself. On the weekend, she met Emma at a small cafe in the city, and over coffee and quiet conversation, she found herself opening up about the marriage in a way she had never allowed herself to with anyone outside of Margaret. Emma listened patiently, her expression shifting between sympathy and quiet anger on Claire's behalf. "You know," Emma said carefully, after Claire finished explaining the phone call she had overheard, "you don't have to stay quiet about this. You don't have to keep shrinking yourself just because he decided not to grow with you. You built a whole life before this marriage. You can build one again, with or without him in it." Claire turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands, considering the words. "I think that's exactly what I'm starting to realize. I don't know what the future looks like yet, but I know I'm done disappearing to make room for someone who never wanted me there in the first place." Emma smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand, much the way Margaret had done just days before. "Then let's start figuring out what that future looks like, together." Walking home that afternoon, Claire felt something she had not felt in 2 years, a quiet but powerful sense of possibility. She did not know yet exactly what her life would become, whether she would stay in the marriage or eventually choose to leave, whether Daniel would ever notice the changes happening within her, or continue his blind indifference forever. But for the first time since her wedding day, she felt like the author of her own story again, rather than a quiet character waiting patiently in someone else's. That night, as she passed Daniel's study on her way to bed, she paused for just a moment, looking at the closed door, listening to the faint sound of him typing at his desk inside. She felt no urge to knock, no lingering hope that tonight might be different from all the others. She simply continued down the hallway to her own room, closed her door softly behind her, and allowed herself, for the first time in a very long time, to fall asleep thinking not about him, but about herself, and about everything still waiting for her to discover it. 3 months passed after the night Claire overheard that phone call, and the woman who now moved through the halls of the house on Maple Hill Road was becoming someone Daniel no longer fully recognized, though he could not yet explain why. She still greeted him politely when their paths crossed. She still managed the household with the same quiet competence she always had, but something underneath her calm exterior had shifted, and even a man as distracted as Daniel could not help but notice the change, even if he refused to admit what it meant. Claire had started working again. Through Emma's connections, she found a position at a small but respected design firm in the city, doing interior design work for private clients, something she had trained for years ago, before the arranged marriage had pulled her away from that path entirely. Her first day back in the working world felt terrifying and exhilarating all at once, like stepping into a version of herself she had left behind for far too long. Her manager, a sharp and kind woman named Laura, recognized Claire's talent almost immediately. "You have a natural eye for this," Laura told her after reviewing her first project proposal, a redesign concept for a client's living space. "Where have you been hiding this skill?" Claire smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. I put it aside for a while. I think I'm ready to pick it back up now. Within weeks, Claire found herself fully immersed in her work, staying late not because anyone forced her to, but because she genuinely enjoyed the challenge, the creativity, the satisfaction of building something beautiful with her own hands and her own vision. Her clients praised her attention to detail, her ability to understand exactly what a space needed to feel warm and alive. For the first time in 2 years, Claire went to sleep at night thinking about ideas and possibilities, rather than lying awake wondering why she was not enough for someone who had never planned to accept her in the first place. The transformation was not only professional. Claire began taking care of herself in ways she had quietly abandoned during the marriage. She started running in the mornings before work, something she used to love in her younger years, feeling her strength and endurance grow week by week. She rediscovered her love of painting, setting up a small easel in the corner of her room, filling canvases with colors that reflected her mood rather than anyone else's expectations. She reconnected with more old friends beyond Emma, rebuilding a social circle that had nearly disappeared during her years of isolation inside the marriage. Margaret watched these changes with quiet pride, often joining Claire for tea in the evenings to hear about her day, genuinely curious about the projects she was working on, the friends she was reconnecting with, the woman she was slowly becoming again. "You are glowing, my dear," Margaret told her one evening, several months into this transformation. "I have not seen you this alive since before the wedding." "I feel alive," Claire admitted, sipping her tea with a small, satisfied smile. "I think I forgot what that felt like." Daniel, meanwhile, began experiencing his own quiet unraveling, though he would not have described it that way at the time. His business had entered a difficult stretch, a major deal falling through unexpectedly, leaving him under pressure from investors and colleagues who had once seen him as untouchable. He found himself, for the first time in years, needing support, needing someone to talk to about the stress weighing on him. Out of old habit, he almost reached for his phone to call the woman he had been seeing quietly for the better part of 2 years, a woman named Grace, who worked in a different branch of his industry, someone he had met at a conference long before his father's illness had forced the arranged marriage upon him. But when he called Grace that particular evening, hoping for comfort, her response left him unsettled in a way he did not expect. "I don't really have time for this right now, Daniel," she said, her voice distracted, almost dismissive. "I have my own things going on. Can we talk about this another time?" Daniel sat alone in his study that night, staring at his phone, feeling a strange hollowness he had not anticipated. He had spent 2 years telling himself that his real connection existed outside his marriage, that Claire was simply an obligation he tolerated, while his true happiness waited elsewhere. But sitting there, rejected even by the person he had convinced himself truly understood him, he felt more alone than he had in a very long time. He walked downstairs later that evening, intending to pour himself a drink in the kitchen, and he found Claire there instead, laughing on the phone with someone, her voice light and warm in a way he had not heard directed toward him in years. She glanced up when he entered, offered a brief, polite nod, and continued her conversation without pausing, without shifting her attention toward him the way she once would have, hoping for even a small acknowledgement. Daniel poured his drink slowly, listening despite himself to her side of the conversation. Something about a client project, about colors and fabric samples, about ideas she was clearly passionate about. He realized, standing there in his own kitchen, that he knew almost nothing about this part of her life, this entire world she had built for herself, while he had been too distracted, too selfish, too consumed by his own choices to notice. When she finished her call, she offered him another polite nod and turned to leave the kitchen, heading toward the stairs. "Claire," he said suddenly, surprising himself with the urge to say her name, to stop her, to create even a small moment of connection. She paused, turning back toward him with an expression that was calm, curious, but notably free of the eagerness she once carried whenever he spoke to her. "Yes?" Daniel found himself at a loss for words, unprepared for this moment, despite having initiated it. "You seem busy lately," he said awkwardly, gesturing vaguely toward her phone. "I am," Claire replied simply, without elaboration, without the desperate need to explain herself that she once might have felt. "Work has been good. I'm enjoying it." "That's good," Daniel said, still searching for something more meaningful to say, something that might extend the conversation. though he could not have explained why he suddenly wanted it extended. Claire waited a moment, polite but unhurried, and when he offered nothing further, she simply said, "Good night, Daniel," and continued up the stairs, leaving him standing alone in the kitchen, with his drink, and a strange, unfamiliar discomfort settling in his chest. That discomfort followed him over the following weeks. He began noticing things he had somehow managed to overlook for 2 years. He noticed that Claire no longer waited for him at dinner. He noticed that she left for work early, dressed with a confidence and purpose he had never seen in her before. He noticed that when they had guests, other men, colleagues from her new job, or old friends from her past, spoke to her with genuine warmth and admiration, and she responded with an easy, natural charm that he realized, with a strange discomfort, he had never truly experienced from her directed toward himself. One evening, at a family dinner that Margaret had organized, Claire arrived slightly late, having come straight from a successful client meeting, still dressed sharply in her work attire, her energy bright and confident as she greeted everyone at the table. A family friend, a businessman named Peter, who had known the family for years, complimented her enthusiastically on a design project he had heard about through mutual acquaintances. "I heard your redesign of the Whitfield estate was absolutely stunning," Peter said, genuine admiration in his voice. "You have quite the talent, Claire. Daniel, you must be very proud of her." Daniel, caught off guard by the question, offered only a stiff, "Yes, of course," while inwardly realizing that he had not actually known the details of the project Peter was referencing. He had not asked Claire about her work in any real depth. He had no idea what the Whitfield estate project even involved. Later that night, as the family gathering wound down, Daniel found himself watching Claire from across the room, observing the way she moved through conversations with ease, the way people gravitated naturally toward her warmth and confidence. Qualities he realized, with growing unease, he had never bothered to notice or appreciate during their 2 years of marriage. He had spent so long treating her as a quiet, forgettable presence in his life, that he had genuinely failed to see the woman she truly was, a woman capable of building something beautiful entirely on her own, with or without him. For the first time since their wedding day, Daniel felt something uncomfortable stir inside him, something that felt uncomfortably close to regret, though he was not yet ready to name it that clearly, not yet ready to admit that the wife he had ignored for 2 years had quietly become someone he could no longer dismiss so easily. Claire, for her part, remained entirely unaware of the shift happening within Daniel, and even if she had noticed it, she would not have allowed it to change her course. She had spent 2 years bending herself around his indifference, and she had no intention of returning to that pattern now, not for a man who had only begun to notice her once she had stopped needing him to. Her life, for the first time in a very long while, belonged entirely to herself, and she intended to keep it that way, regardless of whatever quiet reckoning was beginning to take shape in the mind of the husband who had once treated her like a stranger in her own home. The weeks that followed the family dinner brought a slow but steady unraveling for Daniel, one he could not fully explain even to himself. His business troubles deepened. The failed deal from months earlier had created ripples throughout his company, and now he found himself fighting to reassure nervous investors, while quietly managing a growing sense that the foundation of his life, both professional and personal, was far less stable than he had once believed. Grace, the woman he had been seeing since before his marriage, grew increasingly distant during this period. What had once felt like an easy, understanding connection, now felt strained and one-sided. She rarely returned his calls promptly, often citing work commitments or personal matters she did not care to explain. When they did speak, their conversations felt hollow, lacking the warmth he remembered from earlier years, as though the relationship had been sustained more by circumstance than genuine care. One evening, after weeks of unanswered messages, Daniel finally arranged to meet Grace for dinner, hoping to address the growing distance between them directly. She arrived late, distracted, checking her phone repeatedly throughout the meal. When he finally asked her plainly what was happening between them, she looked at him with an expression that held more pity than affection. "Daniel, I think we both knew this wasn't going to last forever," she said carefully. "You're married. I know it's complicated, but I need something real in my life, not something built around waiting for circumstances to change. I've actually been seeing someone else, someone who isn't tangled up in all of this." Daniel sat in stunned silence, absorbing the words slowly. He had spent 2 years convincing himself that his true happiness existed with this woman, that his marriage to Claire was simply an obstacle, standing between him and the life he truly wanted. Now, hearing Grace speak so plainly about moving on, about wanting something real, he felt the foundation of that belief crumble entirely. He drove home that night in silence, the city lights blurring past his window, his mind replaying the conversation over and over. Somewhere during that long drive, an uncomfortable thought surfaced, one he had been avoiding for weeks. He had built his entire justification for ignoring his wife around a relationship that had never truly been as solid as he believed. He had sacrificed 2 years of a marriage, however unwanted it had originally been, chasing something that had quietly dissolved the moment it became inconvenient for the other person involved. When he arrived home, the house was quiet, the way it usually was at that hour. He walked through the halls slowly, noticing details he had overlooked for years, the careful way the house was maintained, the small decorative touches that reflected Claire's growing talent, fresh flowers in the hallway, a tastefully rearranged sitting room he vaguely remembered her mentioning she had updated weeks earlier. He realized, walking through his own home as though seeing it for the first time, that Claire had been quietly building a beautiful life around him, a life he had never once acknowledged or appreciated. He found himself standing outside her bedroom door, the way she had once stood outside his study door, during the early months of their marriage, hoping for a connection that had never come. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated, uncertain what he would even say if she answered. After a long moment, he lowered his hand and walked away, unable to find the words, though something inside him had clearly shifted. Over the following days, Daniel found himself making small, tentative efforts he had never bothered with before. He asked Claire about her work, genuinely listening when she described her latest project, a boutique hotel lobby she was redesigning for a client in the city. He noticed the way her face lit up when she spoke about her ideas, the confidence in her voice, and he felt a strange mixture of admiration and shame. Admiration for the woman she had become, shame for the years he had spent failing to see her at all. One evening, he arrived home earlier than usual, carrying a small bouquet of flowers, an awkward and unfamiliar gesture for a man who had never once brought his wife flowers in 2 years of marriage. He found her in the garden, sitting near the roses Margaret had planted years earlier, sketching something in a small notebook. She looked up, surprised to see him standing there, holding flowers, looking uncertain in a way she had never seen from him before. "These are for you," he said, holding the bouquet out toward her, feeling strangely nervous, though he could not fully explain why. Claire looked at the flowers, then at him, her expression difficult to read. She accepted them politely, setting them beside her on the garden bench. "Thank you," she said simply, without the emotional reaction he had perhaps unconsciously hoped for. He sat down beside her, an unusual choice for a man who typically avoided any prolonged closeness with her. "I've been thinking," he began slowly, choosing his words with unfamiliar care. "I haven't been fair to you, not from the beginning. I know that's not new information, but I wanted to say it out loud, at least." Claire set down her sketchbook, studying him carefully. "What brought this on?" she asked, her tone curious rather than hopeful, a distinction that Daniel noticed and found unexpectedly humbling. He hesitated, weighing how honest to be. "Things have changed recently. With work, with other parts of my life. I think I've spent a long time avoiding things I didn't want to face, including how I've treated you." Claire nodded slowly, absorbing his words without immediate reaction. 2 years is a long time to avoid something, Daniel. "I know," he said quietly, and for the first time since their wedding day, she heard something in his voice that sounded genuinely regretful, rather than simply obligated. "I don't expect you to forgive me easily, or at all. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what I did, and what I didn't do. I see how hard you've worked to build a life in a house where I made you feel invisible." Claire remained quiet for a long moment, watching the evening light fade over the garden. Part of her wanted to feel something soften inside her at his words, some flicker of the hope she had carried during the early months of their marriage. But 2 years of quiet erasure had taught her caution, and she was no longer the same woman who would have immediately welcomed his sudden attention with open arms. "I appreciate you saying that," she said finally, her voice calm and measured. "But I need you to understand something. I spent a long time trying to earn your attention, hoping that eventually you would choose to see me. I don't think I can go back to hoping like that again. If anything is going to change between us, it has to be real, and it has to be consistent. Not just words on an evening when your other plans fell apart. Her honesty struck him more deeply than he expected, and rather than feeling defensive, he felt a quiet, humbling clarity settle over him. That's fair, he said. I don't expect you to trust this right away. I just wanted to start being honest, even if it's late. They sat together in the garden a while longer, the silence between them different from the silence they had shared for 2 years, less empty now, filled instead with the tentative beginning of something neither of them could yet name. Over the following weeks, Daniel made deliberate, consistent efforts to show up differently. He came home earlier, more often than not. He asked genuine questions about her day, listened without distraction, remembered details from previous conversations. He attended one of her client presentations, sitting quietly in the back of the room, watching her speak with confidence and skill about a design concept she had poured herself into, feeling something that felt remarkably like pride swell in his chest, an emotion he had never once associated with his marriage before. Margaret noticed the changes as well, watching her son with a cautious hope she had not allowed herself to feel in years. "Do you think he means it this time?" she asked Claire one evening, as they sat together in the kitchen. Claire considered the question carefully. "I think he's trying," she said honestly. "Whether it lasts, I don't know yet. I'm not going to abandon the life I've built for myself just because he's finally decided to notice me, but I'm willing to see what happens, as long as he keeps showing up." Margaret nodded, understanding the careful boundary Claire had drawn for herself. "That seems wise, dear. You've earned the right to protect your own heart." As the weeks continued, Daniel's efforts did not waver, and slowly, cautiously, something began shifting between them. Not a sudden return to romance, but a careful, gradual rebuilding, built on honesty rather than obligation, built on genuine effort rather than quiet neglect. Claire remained clear-eyed throughout the process, refusing to fall back into old patterns of desperate hope, insisting instead on real consistency before allowing herself to trust the change happening in front of her. Neither of them could say for certain, during those uncertain weeks, exactly where their marriage was heading. But for the first time since their wedding day, they were both, finally, actually trying. And that alone marked a turning point neither of them had expected 2 years of silence to ever produce. 6 months after that quiet evening in the garden, Claire stood in the kitchen preparing tea, watching through the window as Daniel walked up the driveway earlier than expected, a habit that had become genuinely consistent rather than a rare, fleeting effort. It was strange, she thought, how ordinary this had become. This quiet reliability she had once believed she would never experience in her marriage. It had not happened quickly, and it had not happened without doubt, but slowly, through consistent effort on his part, and careful, guarded openness on hers. Something real had begun to grow between them. Their relationship had not returned to some fairy tale version of love, sudden and overwhelming. Instead, it had built itself piece by piece, through small moments of honesty, shared meals that were no longer eaten in silence, conversations about their days that no longer felt like performances. Daniel had continued attending her work events, had learned the names of her colleagues, had asked thoughtful questions about her projects that showed he was truly listening, rather than simply being polite. He had, on more than one occasion, admitted openly to family members and friends how proud he was of the woman she had become, no longer hiding her accomplishments behind vague, dismissive introductions. But Claire had not simply melted back into the eager, hopeful wife she had once been during those first painful months of marriage. She had maintained her career, her friendships, her sense of self, refusing to let the improvement in their relationship become an excuse to disappear into him the way she once had. She continued working long hours when a project demanded it, continued meeting Emma for coffee, continued painting in the quiet corner of her room that had become entirely her own creative sanctuary. Daniel, to his credit, had learned to respect this independence rather than resent it, understanding, perhaps for the first time, that the woman he had ignored for so long had built a strength during that neglect that would not simply disappear now that he had decided to pay attention. There had been difficult conversations along the way, moments where old wounds resurfaced unexpectedly. One evening, several months into their slow rebuilding, Claire had broken down crying while discussing the early years of their marriage, finally allowing herself to express the full weight of the loneliness she had carried during those 2 silent years. Daniel had sat with her through it, not defensive, not dismissive, simply present, absorbing her pain without trying to rush her through it or minimize what she had endured. "I am so sorry," he had said that night, his own voice breaking slightly, an emotion she had never once witnessed from him during their entire marriage. "I don't think I fully understood, until recently, how much I hurt you. I was so wrapped up in my own resentment about the marriage being forced on me that I never stopped to consider what it must have felt like for you, arriving in a house where you were treated like a stranger by the person who was supposed to be your partner." Claire had wiped her tears, steadying herself before responding. "I needed to hear that," she said honestly, "not because it erases what happened, but because it means you finally understand it. That matters to me." Their conversation that night marked a deeper shift in their relationship, a genuine reckoning, rather than a superficial patch over old wounds. Daniel began actively working to understand not just what he had done wrong, but why he had allowed himself to behave that way for so long, confronting his own resentment about the arranged marriage, his grief over his father's death that he had never properly processed, the ways he had used his relationship with Grace as an excuse to avoid facing his responsibilities at home. Claire, in turn, allowed herself to be vulnerable with him again, carefully, in measured steps, testing whether his new consistency could truly hold the weight of her trust. By the time their 3rd wedding anniversary approached, something had genuinely changed within the walls of the house on Maple Hill Road. Claire found herself, for the first time since her wedding day, looking forward to the anniversary, rather than dreading it or ignoring it entirely. She and Daniel planned a quiet dinner together, nothing extravagant, simply a meal shared between 2 people who had finally learned to see each other clearly. On the evening of their anniversary, Daniel arrived home carrying not an elaborate gift, but something far more meaningful, a small portfolio he had quietly put together, filled with photographs of every project Claire had completed over the past year, along with a handwritten letter expressing everything he had never said to her during the difficult years of their marriage. Claire read the letter slowly, her eyes filling with tears, this time tears that came from a place of healing rather than heartbreak. "I know I can never give you back the 2 years I took from you," Daniel said quietly, watching her read. "But I want to spend the rest of our marriage making sure you never doubt that I see you, that I value you, exactly as you are." Claire looked up at him, and for the first time since their wedding day, she felt something settle peacefully inside her chest. Not the desperate hope of a woman waiting to be chosen, but the quiet contentment of a woman who had built her own strength first, and who now stood as an equal partner in a relationship built on mutual respect rather than obligation. "I believe you," she said softly, "and I think, for the first time, I actually feel like your wife, not just a woman living in your house." Margaret, who had watched this entire transformation unfold with quiet hope over the months, often told Claire how proud she was of the strength she had shown throughout the ordeal. "You never lost yourself, even during the hardest years," Margaret said to her one afternoon in the garden, the same garden where Daniel had first begun his slow journey toward genuine change. "That strength is exactly why he finally woke up. You didn't wait for him to save you. You saved yourself first, and that made all the difference." Claire often reflected on those words in the months that followed, understanding deeply how true they were. She had not stayed in the marriage out of desperation or dependence. She had built an entire life for herself, capable of standing complete and whole without him, and it was precisely that independence, that quiet refusal to keep shrinking herself for someone who had not earned her devotion, that had ultimately created the space for genuine change to occur, both within Daniel and within their relationship as a whole. Their marriage, moving forward, was not without its challenges. Rebuilding trust after 2 years of neglect required ongoing effort, patience, and honest communication that neither of them had fully practiced before. But for the first time since the day they exchanged vows in front of a hall full of guests who believed they were witnessing genuine love, Claire and Daniel were finally building something real, something chosen freely by both of them, rather than forced upon either one by circumstance or obligation. Claire often thought back to that lonely wedding night, the young woman sitting alone in her wedding dress, wondering if she had married a stranger who would never truly see her. She realized now, looking at the life she had built, both independently and within her marriage, that the answer to that fear had ultimately been shaped entirely by her own strength, her own refusal to disappear, her own quiet decision to stop waiting and start living. Daniel had eventually found his way back to her, but only because she had first found her way back to herself. 2 years later, the house on Maple Hill Road looked much the same from the outside. The same tall white pillars, the same garden of roses that Margaret still tended, though now with Claire's help most weekends. Both women kneeling together in the soil, laughing over small things. The kind of easy companionship that had grown between them since the earliest, darkest days of Claire's marriage. But inside those walls, the atmosphere had transformed completely from the cold, silent house it had once been. Claire's design career had flourished beyond what she ever imagined during those lonely early years. Her work on the boutique hotel lobby had caught the attention of a much larger client, a hospitality group looking to renovate several properties across the region, and Laura, recognizing both Claire's talent and her growing reputation, had promoted her to lead designer on the account. Claire now managed her own small team, mentoring a young designer named Alice, who reminded her, in small ways, of herself, before the marriage had nearly swallowed her ambitions whole. She often told Alice, during quiet moments at the office, that talent alone was never enough. Confidence had to be built, protected, and never handed over entirely to someone else's approval. Daniel had changed as well, in ways that extended beyond his relationship with Claire. The difficult period in his business, the failed deal that had once threatened to unravel everything he had built, ultimately became a turning point in his professional life too. He restructured his approach, learned to listen more carefully to his team, and slowly rebuilt his company's reputation through steady, honest work, rather than the aggressive shortcuts he had once relied upon. He often credited this shift, at least privately with Claire, to the lessons he had learned during his personal reckoning, the understanding that genuine relationships, whether in business or in marriage, could not be built on neglect and empty obligation. Their marriage, now firmly rooted in mutual respect, continued to require intentional effort, something both of them had come to accept as simply part of building a real partnership rather than a flaw to be feared. They had established small rituals that mattered deeply to both of them. A weekly dinner where phones were set aside entirely. Regular walks through the garden in the evenings, where they discussed everything from work challenges to quiet dreams for the future. A habit of checking in honestly with each other, rather than allowing resentment or distance to quietly build the way it once had. There were still moments of vulnerability, times when old wounds surfaced unexpectedly. During one particularly difficult week, when Daniel's work demanded long hours away from home, Claire found herself feeling a flicker of the old anxiety, wondering if the distance signaled a return to the patterns of their early marriage. She raised the concern honestly, rather than suffering in silence the way she once might have. "I know this isn't the same as before," she told him one evening, as they sat together in the living room. "But I want to be honest, that the long hours this week made me a little uneasy." I just needed to say that out loud, rather than carrying it quietly. Daniel had listened carefully, without defensiveness, understanding exactly why she might feel that way given their history. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I promise you, this isn't the same. But I understand why old fears might surface, and I never want you to feel like you have to hide that from me again." This kind of honest communication had become the foundation of their marriage, a stark contrast to the silence that had once defined their earliest years together. They had learned, through difficult experience, that real intimacy required vulnerability from both sides, a willingness to voice fears and needs openly, rather than allowing them to fester into quiet resentment. Margaret, now older but still sharp and warm as ever, often remarked on how much joy it brought her to witness the transformation of their marriage. She had watched Claire arrive as a young, hopeful bride, watched her endure years of quiet neglect, and now watched her thrive as a confident, successful woman who had chosen, with clear eyes, to rebuild a relationship with the same husband who had once ignored her so completely. "I used to worry I would watch you fade away in this house," Margaret admitted to Claire one afternoon, as they sat together enjoying tea in the garden. "I am endlessly grateful that instead, you grew stronger than any of us expected, and that strength eventually reached my son too, even if it took him far too long to notice." Claire smiled, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this peaceful moment. "I think, in a strange way, Those difficult years taught me things I might never have learned otherwise. I learned how to stand on my own, how to build a life that belonged entirely to me. I don't regret that growth, even though I wish it hadn't come from so much pain. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Daniel's car pulling into the driveway, earlier than his usual return, a habit that had become entirely consistent over the past 2 years. He walked into the garden, loosening his tie, a familiar gesture that no longer carried the tired indifference it once had. Instead, his face brightened when he saw Claire sitting there, and he crossed the garden to join them, kissing the top of Claire's head gently, before sitting down beside her. "How was your day?" he asked, genuine interest evident in his voice. A simple question that had once felt impossible to imagine coming from him with any real sincerity. Claire told him about a new project her team had just secured, watching his face light up with authentic pride as she described the details. This, she realized, watching him listen so intently, was what she had once hoped for during those lonely early months of their marriage. A partner who genuinely wanted to know her, who valued her thoughts and her work, who no longer treated her presence as an afterthought in his busy life. Later that evening, after Margaret had retired for the night, Claire and Daniel sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. Daniel reached over and took her hand gently, a simple gesture that still, even after 2 years of rebuilding, felt meaningful in a way it never had during their early marriage. "Do you ever think about how differently things could have turned out?" he asked quietly, watching the colors shift across the horizon. Claire considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "Sometimes. I think about that woman who sat alone on her wedding night, wondering if she had married a stranger who would never see her. I think about how easily I could have stayed in that pain, waiting forever for something that might never have come. But I chose, eventually, to stop waiting. I think that choice changed everything, more than anything you did afterward." Daniel nodded, understanding the deeper truth in her words. "You're right. I know I made the changes that mattered, eventually. But you were the one who refused to disappear. You were the one who built a life strong enough that I finally had to notice it. I don't think I deserve the credit for saving this marriage. You saved yourself first, and I was fortunate enough that you allowed me back into the life you built." Claire squeezed his hand gently, watching the last light of the sunset fade into the soft darkness of evening. "We built this together, eventually," she said. "But you're right, that it started with me choosing myself first. I think that's a lesson I'll carry for the rest of my life, no matter what happens next." As the stars began appearing overhead, Claire allowed herself a quiet moment of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this peaceful evening, sitting beside a husband who had finally learned to see her clearly, in a garden that had witnessed both her deepest loneliness and her most powerful transformation. She thought about young women everywhere who might find themselves in similarly painful circumstances, arranged marriages, relationships built on obligation rather than love, and she hoped, quietly, that her story might offer them something valuable. Not a promise that every difficult marriage would eventually heal, but a reminder that their own strength, their own refusal to disappear, mattered more than anyone else's eventual awakening. She had not waited passively for Daniel to change. She had built her own life, brick by brick, moment by moment, until she no longer needed his attention to feel whole. And it was precisely that wholeness, that quiet, powerful independence, that had ultimately created space for something real to grow between them. Something neither obligation, nor grief, nor circumstance could have ever produced on its own. The garden grew quiet around them as evening settled fully into night, the roses closing gently for the day, the same roses that had witnessed 2 years of silent loneliness and 2 more years of careful, honest rebuilding. Claire leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder, feeling, for the first time since that lonely wedding night so many years ago, truly and completely at peace with the life she had chosen to build, one quiet, courageous decision at a time.